The night I came home to Heimir after 10 years, the first thing to reach me was not the horns on the wall or the lords bending in the torchlight of my father's hall. It was a scent that came sideways through the kitchen smoke, green and clean, like rain falling on cut hay, and the moment it touched me, the grief I had carried since the night they buried my father went quiet. Not gone. Set down. As though someone had finally lifted a stone off my chest that I had stopped believing could ever be moved. I stood in the gate with the reins in my hand and my breath fogging in the cold, and I could not have said why my eyes stung. Alpha, Aldous the Reeve came down the steps with his arms spread, his gray robe swinging, his smile as smooth as river ice. Heimir has waited 10 years for this. Welcome home. I let him take my hand. His grip was warm and dry and certain, the grip of a man who had held this hold in his fist for a decade and meant me to feel it. Behind him, the lords made their bows, and the hall glowed gold beyond the door, and somewhere under all of it that green rain scent still moved, faint as a thread, pulling at something behind my ribs I had no name for. "It is good to be home," I said, and it was a lie and a truth at once. I had been 14 the night my father died. I remembered almost nothing of the death itself and everything of the after, the closed door, the cold body I was not allowed to see, the horns blowing low across the river, and then the horse that carried me south to be fostered with the border holds, because a grieving boy could not hold a wolf seat and the Reeve could. That was the reason they gave me. A boy could not hold the seat. So the Reeve held it for me, kept it warm, ruled Heimir in my name while I grew into my shoulders on the border, and learned to fight and to lead and to wait. I had spent 10 years on that border learning to read men. It is a hard school. You sit in judgment over quarrels not your own, a stolen ewe, a broken betrothal, a blood price disputed, and men come before you and lie to your face with their whole hearts. And if you cannot learn to hear the lie under the truth, you will rule badly and men will die of it. I learned. By the end I could sit in the low chair of the border court and tell you, before a man had finished his first sentence, whether he believed what he was saying. It is not a comfortable gift to carry home to the people who raised you. And now I was 25, and the seat was mine, and I had come to take it. They feasted me that night in the great hall under the black banners of my house, and the lords toasted my father's memory, and the Reeve sat at my right hand and told me, in his low, even voice, how faithfully he had kept everything for my return. The rents collected, the granaries full, the border quiet, the peace unbroken. I listened and I nodded and I drank, and all the while my attention kept slipping past him, past the fire, toward the low arch at the hall's end where the servants came and went with the platters, because the scent was strongest there, and every time it reached me the 10-year weight behind my ribs eased, and I did not understand it. Halfway through the meat, a girl came out from under that arch carrying a jug of dark wine. She was thin in the gray of a scullion, her hair covered, her eyes down. She moved along the low tables filling cups, quick and silent, never lifting her face. She was nothing that a hall was meant to notice. The servants who carry the wine are furniture to a feasting lord, no more marked than the trestles or the rushes on the floor. And I could not look away from her, because the scent came off her like warmth off a hearth, and my whole body had gone still and certain in a way I had felt only once before in my life. The day I first shifted, the day I first knew fully what I was. "Mate," said the old blood in me, "that one her." I set down my cup. The lord on my left, Farron, an old graying wolf who had known my father, one of the few faces in that hall I remembered from before, followed my eyes, and his face changed. He leaned close. "Don't, Alpha," he murmured. "Don't what?" "Don't look at that one." His voice dropped so low it was barely breath. "That's the one who killed your father." The hall did not go silent. The fire did not gutter. The world simply tilted, the way ground tilts under a man who has taken a blow he did not see coming, and for a moment I could not hear the feast at all, only the blood in my own ears and the Reeve's smooth voice somewhere far off, and that scent, that impossible green rain scent, coming off the woman my own men were telling me had murdered my father. She reached the high table. She filled the cups of the lords below the dais, one by one, and then she came to the Reeve's cup, and I saw her hand shake as she poured. A small tremor quickly stilled, and I saw that she did not look at him either. She looked at nothing. She poured and stepped back and turned to go, and as she turned her eyes came up, just once, just for the length of a heartbeat, and met mine. They were gray as the river under cloud, and in them was no guilt, no cunning, no plea. Only a kind of tiredness so deep it had gone still, the tiredness of someone who stopped hoping for anything a very long time ago. She looked at me the way you look at a stranger you will never see again, a stranger who cannot help you and cannot harm you, a stranger who is simply another face at another table in a life that has stopped expecting anything from faces. Then she dropped her gaze and was gone under the arch, and the scent went with her, and the stone came back down onto my chest, and I could breathe again, but I did not want to. Her name, I asked Farron. The old wolf hesitated. They call her the silent maid. She hasn't spoken since it happened. He turned his cup slowly in his fingers. Elowen. Her name was Elowen. She was your father's stillroom girl once, trusted. That was the worst of it when it came out that she'd been so close to him. In and out of his own chambers with his tisanes, his sleeping draughts. He'd take nothing from any hand but hers, they said. He shook his head. 10 years, Alpha. Let it lie. The Reeve gave her the only mercy there was. Mercy, I said. Your father's dying word was mercy, they say. He said it with his last breath, and the Reeve honored it, so she wasn't hanged. She was set to the lowest work in the hold, marked and kept, so that everyone who passes her remembers what she did and what mercy spared her. He looked at me with something like pity. It's an old grief. It slept 10 years. Best not to wake it your first night home. I did not answer him. I looked at the Reeve laughing softly at some lord's joke, his gray robe immaculate. A fine silver clasp worked in the shape of a heron catching the firelight on his shoulder. I looked at the golden hall my father had ruled and I now would. I looked at the black arch where she had gone, and behind my ribs the thing that had gone quiet at her scent would not lie down, and I thought, I have been a wolf all my life, and my wolf has never in 25 years told me a lie. Not on the border, not in the shield wall, not in the low chair of the court. And tonight it looked at the woman they say killed my father, and it did not say murderess. It said home. I did not sleep. I lay in my father's old chambers, my chambers now, under furs that smelled of cedar and dust, and I turned it over and over. The scent, the stillness in me, the gray tired eyes with no guilt in them. And the story, the smooth, clean story everyone told the same way, the way Farron had told it and the way I knew, without asking, that every soul in Heir would tell it. The trusted stillroom girl who murdered the Alpha who trusted her, found soaked in his blood, condemned, silenced, kept alive as a living warning by the Reeve's great mercy. It was a good story. It fit together the way a well-made box fits together, every corner square, every joint tight. The trusted servant is always the sweetest villain. The closer the betrayer, the darker the crime. It had a shape a hall could love and repeat, and I had lived long enough on the border, judging men's lies, to have learned one thing above all others. The stories that fit together too well are the ones you should turn over and look at underneath. A true thing is usually rough somewhere. It has a loose end, a piece that doesn't sit, a question no one can quite answer. A made thing is smooth all the way round. This story was smooth all the way round. And there was something else, a small thing, a thing I could not stop turning. She had been trusted. He'd take nothing from any hand but hers. A girl who wanted an Alpha dead and had his whole trust did not need to knife him in a low chamber and be found screaming with his blood to her elbows. She had 100 quieter ways. A wrong herb in the sleeping draught he took from her hand each night. A single leaf, and a grieving hold, and no blood on anyone at all. The girl in the story had the means to kill him invisibly, and had chosen instead the one method that would leave her drenched in guilt and running through the halls. That was not how murderers behaved. That was how the innocent behaved, people who run toward the harm. Before dawn, I rose and went down through the sleeping hole to the crypt beneath the chapel, where my house is laid, and I stood a long time before my father's stone. Garrick, it read, and the years and the wolf of our line carved above. I had not been allowed to stand here as a boy. They had sent me south too fast, before the earth over him had settled. I had never grieved him in the place where he lay. I had grieved him on a strange border in a strange bed, alone. A boy of 14 learning to be a man among strangers who had not loved his father and did not much care that he was dead. "I don't know what happened to you," I said to the stone, and my voice came out rough. "For 10 years I've believed what they told me because I was a child and they were the grown ones and the story fit. But I'm home now, and something in this hold is wrong, and I felt it in the gate before I knew a single reason for it." I laid my hand flat on the cold stone. "I mean to know the truth of you, Father. Whatever it costs me, whatever they've built over it these 10 years, I'll dig it up. I swear it to you here, where you lie." The crypt gave me nothing back but cold and silence. But when I climbed the stair again into the gray first light, I passed the still room door, and it stood ajar. And inside, in the half-dark, a single small figure was already at work by a rushlight, grinding something in a stone bowl with her sleeves pushed up. And the scent of green rain rolled out through the doorway and closed around me, and the weight behind my ribs eased, and I stopped as though I had walked into a wall. She looked up, Eloin, her face bare in the rushlight, thin and grave, and now that I could see her close and unhurried, I saw more than I had in the hall. A fading old mark burned into the skin below her left ear, where the collar of her gray dress fell away. An ugly puckered thing, the Reeves justice mark. I would learn. The mark they burn into the condemned so that no cloak or years can hide what they are. She saw me and went utterly still, the pestle stopping in the bowl. Her whole body braced the way a beaten dog braces, waiting to see which way the blow would come, from which side, how hard. I had meant to speak. I found I could not. We looked at each other across the cold little room full of drying herbs and stoppered jars and the ghost of a dead man's remedies, and something passed between us that had no words in it, older than words, and I saw her recognize it too, saw the flicker of it cross her tired face, a flinch of confusion, because whatever moved in me at her nearness moved in her too, and neither of us understood it. And she was afraid of it, because she had learned to be afraid of everything that was not the small, safe gray round of her days. "I won't hurt you," I said. It was a strange thing to say to a murderess. It came out of me before I could weigh it, in the plain voice you'd use to a frightened animal, and I heard how strange it was even as I said it, and I did not take it back. She did not answer. Of course she did not. She had not spoken in 10 years. But her hand, where it gripped the edge of the table, loosened by the smallest degree, and her gray eyes for just a moment were not tired. They were searching my face as though looking for a trap in it, going over it feature by feature the way a woman reads a sky for weather, and finding no storm in it, and not knowing what in the world to do with that, because kindness from a lord's face was a thing outside her experience, and she had no shelf to set it on. Footsteps came along the passage, an even, unhurried tread, a walk that never needed to hurry because everything in the hold waited on it. Her whole body clenched again. The rushlight seemed to shrink. And Aldous the Reeve appeared in the doorway behind me, his gray robe immaculate even at dawn, his smile ready, the heron clasp bright on his shoulder. "Alpha, you're abroad early." His eyes went past me to Eloin and back, and something cool and quick moved in them, a flick of calculation gone before you could name it. "I hope this creature wasn't disturbing you. She keeps the still room. It's the one useful thing left in her." He said it lightly, the way you'd remark on the weather, and I watched Eloin's face close like a shutter over a lit window, and I watched her go back to her grinding with her head down as though she had heard nothing, as though the words had not been about her, as though she were not there at all. And I understood, watching her make herself absent, that she had done it 10,000 times, that being spoken of as a creature and a thing in the third person while she stood 2 feet away was the ordinary weather of her days. She wasn't disturbing me, I said. Good, come then. There's the morning's business, and the Lord's to receive, and much for you to learn of how Heir is run before you take its reins fully in hand. He stood aside to let me pass, courteous, certain, and as I went by him I caught, under the clean lavender scent of his robe, something else, a faint sourness, the smell a man gives off when he is very pleased with himself and thinks no one can tell, and I thought of the tremor in Aloan's hand last night when she poured his wine, and the way she would not look at him, and the way she flinched at his tread before ever she saw his face. She was not afraid of me, the Alpha, the son of the man she was said to have killed, the one soul in Heir with the most reason to want her dead. Of me she was only wary, the way she was wary of everything. She was afraid of him. I filed that away, small and cold and hard, and I went to do the morning's business with a smile on my face, because I had learned on the border that the first thing you must do when you mean to dig up a smooth buried thing is let no one see you holding the spade. A regent who has ruled 10 years in a boy's name will have eyes in every doorway and ears at every hearth. If I wanted the truth I would have to go slowly and softly, and let the reeve believe the returned Alpha was exactly the grieving, grateful, easily managed young lord he had been counting on all these years. So that is the man I let him see, for 3 days. I received the lords in the great hall and thanked each for his loyalty and gave each some small mark of favor, and I watched, as they came and went, which of them looked to the reeve before they answered me, which of them, when I asked a question, let their eyes flick to the gray robe by my chair to check the shape of the answer before they gave it. Most of them did. 10 years is long enough to teach even proud men where the true seat of a hold sits, and it was not in the Alpha's chair. I rode the bounds with a hunting party of the reeves, choosing and praised the fat granaries and the quiet border, and I let them think I saw only what they showed me. But I have an eye for a hold bred and beaten into me, and under the show I saw the other things. The tithe pressed a little too hard, the freeholders a little too silent, the reeve's own kin planted in every office that touched silver, the record keeper, the granary master, the captain of the hold guard, all of them men who owed Aldous their bread and would lose it the day his fortunes turned. He had not merely ruled Heir. He had grown into it like a root into a wall, until you could not say where the wall ended and the root began, and you could not pull the one without bringing down the other. And I sat at his right hand each evening and asked him 100 small, idle questions about the running of it all, the innocent questions of a young lord eager to learn, and out of his own smooth answers I built the map of him, who owed him, who feared him, who had grown fat under his 10 years and would not want the ground disturbed. It was most of them. That was the trouble and the danger both. He had made so many men's comfort depend on his story staying, buried that half the hold had a stake in my father's death staying settled, whether they knew the truth of it or not. On the second day I found reason to visit the record room, where the hold keeps its ledgers and its judgments, and I made a great show of a son's dutiful interest in his father's stewardship, the rolls of rents, the tallies of the herds, the old accounts. The record keeper, a dry, narrow man named Osric with the reeve's own look about the eyes, watched me the whole while, helpful and cold, and fetched me whatever I named. I named a great many dull things. And in among the dull things, as though it were one more, I named the roll of my father's death, the record of the trial, the testimony, the judgment. Osric's hands went still on the shelf. That is a sorrowful old matter, Alpha. Are you certain you wish to? I never grieved him properly, I said, and let my voice thicken, which was not hard, for it was true. I was a boy. They sent me away before I understood. I would read the truth of it now as a man. Is that so strange? He fetched it. He could not well refuse the Alpha his own father's death roll. But he fetched it slowly, and he stayed at my shoulder while I read, and I felt his eyes on every page, and I read it the way you'd read anything under a jailer's watch, slowly, mildly, letting nothing show, while underneath I took it apart joint by joint. And it came apart in my hands like wet bread. There was no confession. Nowhere in all those careful pages did the girl confess. There was only the Reeves' own account of finding her bloodied and the testimony of 4 witnesses, and I marked the 4 names, and over the next day, without ever seeming to ask, I learned what had become of them. 1 was dead. 2 had grown rich in the years since, granted freeholds and offices well above their old station, and the 4th had left Heir altogether the season after the trial, gone away north with a purse of silver, no man knew quite where. 4 witnesses to a murder, and 10 years later 2 were bought and 1 was fled and 1 was in his grave. That is not how honest testimony ages. Honest witnesses grow old in their same houses and tell the same tale grudgingly to their grandchildren. Bought witnesses vanish or rise. And the healer, the one man who might have said with his own trained eyes how the wound was made, whether a knife driven by a strong arm or a small woman's frightened hand, whether from the front in a struggle or from behind in the dark. The healer who had tended my father's body that night was 10 years in the ground, taken by a fever the very next winter. I found his name in the roll. I found his widow, too, still living in a cottage below the walls, and I filed her away for later, a small bright coin of a possibility, because a healer talks to his wife of a night, and a wound is the kind of thing a man carries home in his mind and speaks of in the dark. Smooth all the way round, and yet now that I had my hands under it, I could feel every place the smoothness had been laid on to cover a rough seam. The trial had not found the truth. The trial had been built, board by board over the truth, by a man who had a decade to plane every splinter flat. I gave Osric back the roll and thanked him and spoke of the herds again, and I let him carry to the Reeve, as I knew he would, that the Alpha's interest in the old matter had been a boy's sad curiosity and nothing more. But I had the 4 names, and the healer's grave, and the widow in her cottage, and I had a shape now. The shape of a lie so large it had needed 4 bought mouths and a convenient fever to stand up, and had cost a girl her voice and 10 years of her life to keep standing. On the 4th night I went down to the still room again, alone, after the hold had gone to sleep. She was there. She was always there, I had learned. It was where she was allowed to be, the one place the shunning eased because no one else wanted the cold little room full of the dead man's herbs, and so it had become hers by default, the single small country in all of Heir where she was not stared at. She was mending a torn sack by rushlight, and when I came in she rose at once and stood with her eyes down and her hands folded, waiting, in the posture 10 years had taught her. "Sit," I said, "please." She did not sit. She was a scullion and I was the Alpha, and there were 10 years of the world telling her, in every waking hour, what happened to a marked woman who forgot the distance between those 2 things. So I sat instead on the low stool by the cold hearth, to make myself small, to put my head below the level of hers, and after a long moment, a long, wary, disbelieving moment, she perched on the very edge of the bench across from me, ready to be gone at a breath, wary as a bird that has been thrown stones at every well it ever came to. "I know you can't answer me," I said. "You don't have to say a word, just let me talk, and if what I say is wrong you shake your head. Can you do that much, only that?" A long stillness, then slowly the smallest nod, "Yes, that much." "They tell me you killed my father." I watched her face. It did not flinch the way a lie flinches, that small backward flick a guilty face makes before it settles into its defense. It only went grave and old and terribly tired, and her gray eyes came up and held mine steady, and she shook her head. Once, slowly, "No." Something in my chest, which had been braced for 10 years without my knowing it, cracked clean down the middle. Because I have watched 100 men deny 100 crimes, and I know the difference between a man saying no to escape a rope and a woman saying no to a thing that is simply, wholly untrue, and this was the second, and my wolf had known it from the gate. "They found blood on your hands," I said. She looked at her own hands, turned them over, palms up in the rushlight as though they were not quite hers, the hands that had cost her everything. And then, carefully, watching me the whole time to see if she was permitted, she reached up and pressed both her palms flat and hard to the side of her own throat, pressing, the way you press a wound to hold the life in. And she looked at me. And I understood, the way you understand a thing all at once and completely, so that you cannot afterward remember not knowing it, that she had not put my father's blood on her hands by taking his life. She had put it there trying to keep it in him. I had to look away from her for a moment, at the cold ash in the hearth, until I could trust my voice. "You found him," I said. "He was already hurt. You tried to stop the bleeding." Her eyes filled. She nodded, and a tear went down her thin cheek, the first I had seen her allow herself, and she pressed the back of her wrist hard against her mouth to hold in whatever sound wanted to come, because she had trained herself for 10 years to make no sound at all, and even grief could not be let out for fear of where a sound might go. "Why didn't you say so?" I whispered. "At the trial, when they stood you up before the hold and named you murderess, why didn't you speak? One word, you could have told them all of it." And there her whole face changed. The grief went out of it and something else came in, something that made the hair rise on my arms and the wolf stir under my skin. A flash of pure animal fear, the fear of a creature that has learned exactly, precisely where the trap closes and how the teeth come down. She shook her head hard, no, no, and her eyes went to the door, to the black passage, to the dark beyond it where the Reeves chambers lay, and back to me. And she pressed one finger to her own lips and shook her head again. Not I cannot speak, but I dare not, and I understood that too, and the cold thing in me finished turning to iron. Someone had made her silence a cage, and turned the key and kept it. Someone had a hold on her deep enough that she had swallowed 10 years of shame, the mark, the shunning, the name, rather than open her mouth even once to save herself. And I did not think it was grief that had done it, nor fear for her own life. A woman who had already lost everything, but her breath does not stay silent to keep her breath. It had to be something she loved more than her own life. And the man who held it stood at my right hand each evening and smiled like river ice. "Elowen," I said the first time I had spoken her name, and she startled at it, at the sound of her own name in an alpha's mouth, spoken gently, as though she were a person and not a thing. "I am going to find out what truly happened to my father. I've begun already. I've read the trial, and it's a lie built out of bought men and a dead healer, and I can see the hand that built it. I am not going to stop, and I am not going to let anyone hurt you for what I find. I swear it on his stone, where I stood 4 nights ago and swore it to him. Do you believe me?" She looked at me for a very long time, and whatever she saw in my face, whatever the bond let her feel of the truth of what I meant, for I think she felt it as I did, that impossible rightness running between us like a current under ice. I watched her decide, slowly, painfully, against 10 years of hard-won caution, to risk believing one more thing before the world could take even that from her. She nodded, and then, unbidden, she reached across the small cold space between us and laid her fingers, light as a falling leaf, on the back of my hand. The first time she had touched me, the first time, I would come to understand, that she had touched another living soul by her own free will in longer than she could count. And where her skin met mine, the green rain scent flared bright, and the whole 10-year weight went off my chest at once, clean, like a held breath let go, and I saw her breath catch. And I knew she felt it too, the rightness of it, the coming home of it, the thing neither of us had a word for and both of us had known since the gate. For a moment we only sat there, her fingers on my hand, both of us undone by it. Then the tread came in the passage, even, unhurried, and she snatched her hand back and was on her feet, and at the far bench with her eyes down and the mending in her lap before I had drawn a full breath, gone back inside her 10-year stillness like a creature into its shell, and Aldous stood in the doorway with his candle, and his smile, and his cool, quick eyes going from me to her and back, weighing, always weighing. Alpha, he said softly, you keep strange company for a lord and strange hours. I keep my own company where I please, I said, and rose and did not hurry, and let my shoulders fill the small room, in my own hold, Reeve, at whatever hour suits me. I let him see nothing but a young lord's mild pride. The still room's herb steep a draught that helps a man sleep. I was asking after it. My father took one, I'm told, every night of his life. Something moved behind the Reeve's eyes at that, the smallest thing, a shadow crossing water, and I marked it, and I thought, yes, the draught, there's a raw nerve, I'll come back to it. Of course, he said, silk over the iron. I'll have one sent up. You need not trouble the still room yourself, it's no fit place for the Alpha. But his eyes rested on Aloin a moment longer than they needed to, and there was a message in that look, cold and plain, and I saw her receive it, saw her go smaller, paler, her hands going still on the mending, and I thought, whatever you are holding over her, Reeve, I am going to find it and take it out of your hands, if I have to break every finger you own to open your grip. I bade him a pleasant good night and went up and lay awake till dawn, and I did not send for his draught, and I planned. The next morning I found the cook. Maid was the oldest servant in the hold, so old and so far beneath the Reeve's notice that she had survived 10 years no man thought to silence. Alone in the smoke and clatter of the great kitchen where nobody listens because everybody is shouting, and the fires roar and the pots bang, and a word spoken low into the din, is safer than a word spoken anywhere else in Heir. I came to her not as the Alpha but as a hungry man, and I sat on a flour barrel out of the traffic and ate her bread hot off the stone and praised it honestly until her seamed old face softened, and I let her talk, and slowly, I turned the talk backward, 10 years back, to the old Alpha, to the way things had been before the gray robe ruled. Ah, your father, her eyes went wet and far away. There was an Alpha, fair, hard when he had to be, fair always. You favor him in the shoulders and the standing of you. She wiped her floury hands on her apron. He'd come down here of a winter night, sit where you're sitting on that very barrel and eat my bread same as you're doing and never mind the crown of him. A man could talk to him. That's rarer in a lord than you'd think, being a man a body can talk to. And Aloin, I said, careful, light, turning my bread in my hands. The still-room girl, he trusted her, they say. The old woman went still. Her eyes came up and swept the kitchen, the door, the passages. The other servants bent over their work, the way everyone's eyes went when that name was spoken aloud, checking who stood near. Then she leaned close, and her voice dropped to the barest rasp under the din of the fires. That child never harmed a hair of his head, she breathed. I'll say it to you, though I've said it to no living soul in 10 years, because you've got your father's own eyes looking at me, and I'm too old to fear the rope now. She loved him like he was her own blood. He'd taken her in when she was orphaned, her and her little brother both, half-starved and homeless the pair of them, set her to the still room where her gentle hands were a gift, gave the boy to the stables. He was the nearest thing to a father either of those children ever had. She'd have died for him. She'd have died a dozen times over before she let harm come near him. Then what happened, Maida, that night? Her hands twisted in her apron, knotting and unknotting. I don't know the whole of it. No living soul does but the Reeve, and the Reeve tells it his way, and his way is the only way that's been let be told. But I know what I saw with these eyes. She swallowed, and the old fear crossed her face, and she pushed through it. I saw her run up screaming from the low chamber that night, the only night in her life I ever heard that child make a loud sound, with the Alpha's blood to her elbows and on her dress and in her hair, screaming for help, screaming that he was hurt, that he was cut, that someone had done it, and to bring water, bring cloths, bring the healer, screaming it over and over till her voice tore. Does a murderer do that? Does a murderer run through the whole hold, rousing every soul in it to come and save the man she's just cut down? I've lived 70 years, and I never heard of such a murderer. No, I said quietly. Nor have I. And I know, she went on lower still, that by the trial's end it was her mouth they'd stopped and her hands they'd blamed, and the reeve himself stood up before the whole hold in his grey robe and gave the judgment with his own tongue, and no one gainsaid him, for who would? He held the seat. He held everything. She drew a shaking breath. And I know one thing more, Alpha, that I've never told, that I've held in my chest 10 years like a stone. The very next day after the judgment, the very next morning, her little brother was sent away, north, to the reeve's own holding up in the hills. To keep the boy safe, the reeve said, out of the shame of his sister's crime where none will hold it against him. A kindness, he named it. A boy of 9, taken from the only sister he had in the world and carried off to strangers keeping in the hills. Her old eyes came up to mine, and they were terrible, brimming and fierce. That boy's a man grown now, Alpha, near 10 years on, and I have never once in all those years seen him set foot in Heir. Not once. Not a visit, not a feast day, not his own sister's name day. A brother that loved her and gone, clean gone, the day after she was condemned, into the reeve's own hand and never let home. You set those two things side by side, her silence and the vanished boy, and you tell me what shape they make between them. They made a very clear shape. They made a hostage. The reeve had killed my father. I was as certain of it now as I had ever been certain of anything, though I still had no single proof I could set before the hold and make them believe it against 10 years of the other story. He had killed my father, and the girl had come running with the truth of it on her lips, and so he had turned her own grief into her crime and stopped her mouth with a mark and a name. And then, to make her silence sure not for a season but forever, he had taken the one thing she loved more than her own life, her little brother, into his own hands, and carried the boy off to the hills, and let her understand, without ever once needing to say it aloud, exactly what would happen to that child if she ever spoke a single true word. And she had chosen. She had weighed 10 years of shame and servitude and a burned mark on her throat, and a whole hold spitting the name murderous at her back against her brother's small breathing life, and she had chosen the boy, and paid, every day in silence, for 10 years. I sat on the flour barrel with the old woman's good bread gone cold and forgotten in my hand, and I have led men into fights, and stood in the shield wall where friends died at my shoulder, and I do not weep easily, but I came near to it there in the smoke and clatter of my father's kitchen. "Where is the boy now?" I asked low. "You said the reeve's holding in the hills. Does it have a name?" "Greywater." Maid gripped my wrist with her flower-white claw of a hand, hard, and her voice went urgent. "A day's ride north up past the fells. But Alpha, hear me now. Hear an old woman who's watched that gray snake 10 years. The reeve is not a fool, and he is not slow, and he did not keep that girl alive these 10 years out of any mercy, whatever pretty word he hung on it. He kept her because a mute murderess suits him. As long as she's silent, she's no threat, and she's a comfort to his pride. His living warning, he calls her, and it pleasures him to have her under his eye each day, marked and dumb and broken, the proof of his justice walking the halls. But mark this, and mark it well. The very hour he believes her silence is failing, the hour he thinks her tongue might loosen, that someone might unlock it, she stops being a comfort and becomes the one deadly danger to him in all the world, the single mouth that can undo his 10 years with a sentence. And on that hour he will not wait. He kept her 10 years because a silent murderess was useful. Give him one reason to fear she'll speak, and he'll have her in the river before you've found your proof, and her brother in a grave in the hills, and he'll grieve them both prettily at your side. Do you understand what I'm telling you? The girl's safety and the boy's both hang on the reeve believing that snare of his still holds. I understood. I understood all of it, and it changed what I did next, and it may have saved 2 lives. I moved that same day, but I moved on 2 roads at once, and I set them against each other. The first road, the true one, I kept hidden. I called my 2 most trusted men to me in my own chamber with the door barred, Bran and Corin, border wolves I had brought home at my back, men who had bled beside me and owed the reeve nothing and me everything, men whose faces no one in Heimir yet knew well enough to read. I told them the whole of it, low and plain. And I sent them riding hard and quiet out the north gate before the noon meal, in plain traveling clothes with no badge of mine on them, bound for Greywater in the hills, with orders to reach the reeves holding by whatever pace the horses would bear, to find the young man named Perrin, and to bring him out and home to Heimir safe by whatever means the day required. By silver if silver would do it, by the strength of their arms if it would not, and above all, above every other thing, to breathe not one single word of their errand to any soul in Heimir before they rode, and to ride as though they went hunting, and to be gone before anyone thought to wonder. That was the true road, and it was a race, and its running clock frightened me more than anything had frightened me since I was a boy of 14 watching the horse carry me south. The second road was a decoy, and I laid it deliberately, because Maida's warning had shown me the shape of my danger and I saw how to turn it. The reeve must not see me getting close to the truth, but I could not hide forever that I was digging. So I would let him see me dig, but at the wrong grave. I would draw his fear away from the still-room girl and the boy in the hills, and fix it on something safely dead. The old trial, the old testimony, the paper record. Let him spend his fear on the ledgers, while my men rode for the one thing that could truly hurt him. So that evening I let the reeve find me in the record room again, but not mild this time, not a boy's sad curiosity. This time I let him find me troubled and dangerous, poring over the trial roll by candlelight with a son's raw grief on my face and the pages spread wide, and I let him see me frowning over the very things I had marked. The missing confession, the vanished witnesses, the dead healer. "This is old pain, Alpha," he said gently, coming to my shoulder, his candle throwing our two shadows huge and wavering up the wall. "Why torment yourself with it, and so late? The matter was tried and judged and settled justly, 10 years since." "Was it?" I said, and let my voice shake, which cost me nothing, for the grief in it was real even if the shaking was chosen. "Look here, reeve, these 4 witnesses, one dead, 2 grown rich and landed since the very year they swore Aldous granted freeholds above their station, and the 4th gone away north with silver no man knows where, and the healer who saw the wound dead of a fever the next winter, and nowhere in all these pages did the girl confess. I have read it 4 times through. She never confessed. You built a murder out of 4 mouths, and half of them are bought or fled or in the ground, and the one honest man who saw the body is dead." I looked up at him. "That is a strange way for the truth to age, reeve. Truth grows stubborn and stays put. Only lies rot this cleanly." A silence. In the candlelight I could not read all of his face, but I felt the stillness come off him, the swift cold calculation, the mind behind the smile running fast, and I knew I had set the hook deep. "The evidence was overwhelming," he said at last, and his voice was as even as ever, but there was iron under it now, and the smile had gone somewhere behind his eyes. "A confession is not needed, Alpha, when a woman is found soaked to the elbows in her own master's blood, screaming over his cooling body with the death wound fresh. The hold saw it. I saw it. Grief has made you seek a mystery where there is only an old and simple horror." "Perhaps," I said. And then I let the second half of the trap fall. The words Maida had warned me never to let him think, spoken now on purpose, aimed like an arrow. I closed the roll and set my hand on it and looked him full in the face, a young lord one push from tearing his 10 years to the ground. Or perhaps I'll ask her myself. The girl. Now that I'm home, now that I'm her Alpha and not a frightened boy of 14, perhaps her tongue will loosen for me where it never would for the judge who condemned her. They say she's been silent 10 years, but a woman will say things to the murdered man's own son, reeve, that she'd never say to the court. I mean to sit with her. I mean to have her voice. One way or another, I mean to hear from her own mouth what happened in that low chamber. I watched it land. I watched the reeve who was so very good, so long practiced, so smooth fail for one single half instant to hold his face. I watched the cold flicker of true fear cross it, there and gone, quick as a fish turning in dark water. And I knew that I had just told him the one thing that would make him move, and that I had told it him on purpose, and that now the trap was armed and set, and the only question left in the world was whether Bran and Corran would reach Greywater and get the boy clear before the reeve, thinking his snare about to fail. Did the thing a cornered killer does to a witness he can no longer trust to stay silent. "You should rest, Alpha," he said smoothly, the mask back in place. The smile returned but not reaching his eyes. "You're overwrought, and no wonder, so newly home to so much old sorrow. We'll speak of this again when you're calmer in the daylight." "Yes," I said. "Good night, Reeve, sleep well." Neither of us meant to sleep at all. I went up to my chamber and I did not undress. I put out my candle and I sat in the dark by the narrow arrow slit that looked down on the courtyard, and I set my back to the cold stone, and I watched, and I waited, and my wolf lay coiled and ready and hungry just under my skin. I had baited him. Now I would see him take it, and God help me if I had read him wrong, for if he sent no one tonight, then he had swallowed his fear and would take his time, and I would have shown my hand for nothing. I had not read him wrong. It was past the deep middle of the night, the coldest black hour, when the Reeves men came for her. I heard them before I saw them, the too careful quiet of men trying hard not to be heard, which is a louder thing in the night than they ever believe. 3 of them crossing the courtyard toward the kitchen stair with a shuttered lantern throwing one thin blade of light, and a coil of rope over one man's shoulder, and their heads down, and their pace that particular guilty creep. I was up off the floor and out my door and down the tower stair 3 steps at a stride and through the black passages, moving the way a wolf moves in its own den, silent and certain in the dark, and I came out into the low passage behind them just as they reached the still room door and laid their hands upon it, and I let my wolf come up into my voice. "Lay one hand on that door," I said, out of the dark behind them, "and I will open you from throat to belly where you stand and leave you for the morning." They spun. 3 of them, hard men, the captain's men, and they had steel half drawn before they'd finished turning. And then the shuttered lantern swung round, and its thin light fell on my face, and they saw who stood behind them in the dark, and the steel wavered and stopped, because a hold guard may take a Reeves silver and do a Reeves dirty work in the night, but he is bred and born and raised with the fear of an alpha in the very marrow of his bones. And I stood there, and let them feel every inch of what I was. I did not shift. I did not need to shift. I have stood in the shield wall and held a line of frightened men by will alone. I know how to fill a narrow passage with the whole promise of a wolf and leave no room in it for a man's courage. "The Reeve sent you," I said, "in the black of the night, to take the silent maid out of my hold by rope and make her vanish, and be sure she was gone before her alpha could sit and ask her a single question. That is the errand, isn't it? Say it isn't if you dare." They said nothing, not one of them. Their silence was the whole confession, and it rang in that passage louder than any words. "Put down your steel," I said, "and put down your rope and go to the guardroom and bar yourselves in and stay there till daylight, and touch nothing and no one on the way. Do that, and when this night's reckoning comes I may remember that you obeyed your alpha in the end when it counted, and it may go easier with you." And I let the wolf rise higher, until the light in my eyes was its light and not a man's. "Draw on me now here in the dark, and let us learn together how 3 paid men fare against the thing you've woken. Choose. I haven't the patience of my father, and it is very late." They put down the steel. They put down the rope. They went, quick and stumbling, back the way they'd come, and they did not look behind them, and they barred themselves in the guardroom till dawn as I'd bidden. They were not brave men, only bought ones, and bought men do not spend their lives for a reeve when an alpha is standing in the black with the wolf awake in his eyes and the night gone suddenly, terribly quiet around him. I opened the still room door. She was awake. Of course she was awake. She had heard them coming long before I had, I think, 10 years of lying rigid in the dark listening for the tread that meant harm had sharpened her ears past any wolf's. And she was standing pressed back into the far corner beside the cold hearth, with a small paring knife from her own herb table held out before her in both her shaking hands, blade up, braced to sell the last of her life at whatever price it would fetch. And when the door swung wide and she saw that it was me, she did not lower the knife. She stared at me over the trembling point of it, and I understood, and it broke my heart. She did not yet dare believe that the one who came through the door in the killing hour was the one who meant to save her, and not simply the next turn of the same endless trap. "They're gone," I said very quietly, and I did not move from the doorway. "I sent them off, down to the guardroom, barred in till morning. No one is going to take you tonight, Aloan. And no one, hear me, no one is ever going to come for you in the dark again, not while I draw breath in this hold." I stayed where I was and let her keep the whole room and the knife and her fear entire. I did not spend one step toward her that she had not first allowed. "I know everything now. I know he killed my father. I know you came running with the truth on your lips and his blood on your hands from trying to save him. I know he took your brother north to Greywater to make a leash of the boy, and that you've held your silence 10 years to keep that child breathing. I know all of it, Aloan. And I've already sent men, good men, my own, sworn to me, riding hard for Greywater this very night, to bring your brother out and home and safe beyond the Reeves' reach forever. By tomorrow's dark the leash is cut. And then, Aloan, you never ever have to be afraid again." The knife lowered, only an inch but an inch. Her eyes, huge and wild in the rushlight, searched my face the way a drowning soul searches the dark water for the one hand, and I watched the hope trying to force its way in through 10 years of scar, and I watched the scar fighting to keep it out, because hope had only ever been another way for the world to hurt her worse, and she had learned, at terrible cost, not to let it in. I watched the war of it move across her thin, brave face, and I could not bear to make her fight it one moment longer alone. "I felt it in the gate," I said, and my own voice was no longer steady. "The very first night, before I had so much as seen your face, before I knew your name, before anyone had spoken it. My whole life's grief for my father, 10 years of it, that I'd carried like a stone I'd stopped believing could ever be lifted. It went quiet, all at once, the moment I breathed you on the smoke of this kitchen. And I didn't understand it, and I told myself it could not be, could not possibly be, because they were all telling me you were the one who'd, but my wolf has never lied to me, Aloan. Not once in 25 years. Not on the border, not in the shield wall, not in the judgment seat. And it looked at you across a hall full of men calling you murderess, and it did not say murderess. My voice broke, and I let it break, and I did not look away from her. It said mine. It said home. You are the mate the moon shaped for me before either of us drew breath. And they have had you scrubbing their floors and wearing their mark and answering to killer for 10 years. And I am going to spend every remaining day of my life making that right, if you will let me. But even if you never will, even then, I am going to see you free." The knife fell out of her hands and rang on the stone flags, bright in the silence. And then she was crossing the little room, 1 step, 2, 3, 4, and her arms were around me, and her thin body was shaking against mine with the sobs she had held prisoner for 10 years finally tearing free. And they came silent, silent even now, even here, her whole self convulsing with them and not a sound escaping, because 10 years had built the silence so deep into her that even breaking she could not break it. And I wrapped her up in both my arms and held her hard against me. The way you hold something that has been dropped and dropped and dropped 1,000 times by careless hands and has finally been caught. And I put my face down in her covered hair, and the green rain scent rose warm around us both. And behind my ribs, the last splinter of the 10-year stone crumbled away to nothing, and I was not ashamed of the wet on my own face. We stood like that a long time in the cold small room that smelled of herbs and dust and a dead man's remedies. 2 people the world had lied about and lied to, holding on. At last she drew back, not far, only far enough to tip her face up and look at me, and there was something new in her tired gray eyes now, something I had not seen in them once in all our meetings. Not hope only, but purpose. She had believed me. And having decided to believe me, she had decided in the same breath to give me the last thing she owned in all the world. The thing she had guarded through 10 years of shame and silence and the killing dark. The thing she had never once dared show a single living soul. The thing she had kept, I would understand, not for her own sake, but for exactly this hour and this man. She took my hand, and she led me to the cold hearth. She knelt on the stone before it and reached up into the black soot-choked throat of the flue, into the greasy dark where no one ever cleans and no one would ever think to look. And she worked her fingers into a gap between two old fire-blackened bricks and drew something loose, a small bundle wrapped in oiled cloth, itself blackened over 10 years of hearth smoke and grime, until it was near the color of the soot that hid it. She brought it out and unwrapped it in her lap with trembling fingers, there in the pooled rushlight, and she laid the truth bare before me at last. Inside lay my father's signet ring, his own seal, the wolf of our house cut deep in dark stone, the ring that had been named lost the night he died, and never found in 10 years of not looking. And its band was still dark in the graven lines, with a stain that no scrubbing had lifted in all that time. And beside it, folded small, a torn scrap of fine gray wool with a clasp still fixed through it. A silver clasp, delicately worked, in the shape of a heron with its neck curved down to strike. I knew that clasp. I had seen its twin 4 nights running now, in the gate the night I came home, in the still-room doorway at dawn, at my right hand at every evening meal, pinned to the shoulder of a gray robe. The heron was the Reeve's own crest. She pressed the ring into my open palm and closed my fingers over it with both her small hands, and then she lifted my closed fist and pressed it against her own heart, and she looked up at me, and there in the rushlight I watched Aloan, who had not made a sound in 10 years, who had swallowed her own living voice down into the dark to keep a child alive, who had let a whole hold name her the worst thing a person can be sooner than let one word slip. I watched her open her mouth and reach down into that buried place and force her ruined, 10 years unused voice up out of it, cracked and rasping and scarcely more than breath, and shape it, for me, into the first words she had spoken in a decade. I saw him, she whispered. I saw the Reeve do it. I tore this from his cloak with my own hands as he fled, and I took the ring from his fist, and I have kept them both 10 years up the cold chimney for the Alpha's son to come home. I will tell you how I called the hold to reckoning, because a woman kept 10 years in the dark and the cold and the shame deserves to have her son brought up properly, in the full sight of everyone who wronged her, and not smuggled in by a back stair. I did not go to the Reeve in the black of that night and open his throat, though God knows my wolf strained at me to do exactly that, and it would have been the easier thing. But a killing in the dark would only have made one more smooth story for the hold to swallow, the young Alpha, mad with old grief, murdering his faithful Regent in his bed, and Heir had choked down enough smooth stories to last it an age. No. I let the Reeve pass the rest of that night believing, for all he knew, that his men had done their work and the girl was gone into the river and his 10 years were safe. And at the first gray of dawn I had the great war horn blown from the wall, the horn that summons all of Heir to the hall, high and low, lord and scullion, that had not sounded once since the black day of my father's burial. And I had Bran's own borrowed men, and the household guard I trusted, quietly seal every door of the great hall from the inside, and I stood up alone on the dais beneath the black banners of my house with my father's stained ring closed in my fist. And I waited while the whole hold came crowding and murmuring and half asleep, and wandering into the hall. And Aldous the Reeve came in last of all, as such men always do, in his immaculate gray robe with the silver heron bright upon his shoulder, and his river-ice smile ready on his face. For he did not yet know his men had failed, did not yet know the girl still breathed, and could not yet, even now, quite make himself believe that the ground he had stood on for 10 unchallenged years had truly, finally moved beneath him. "Reeve," I said, and my voice carried to every stone of that hall. 10 years ago you stood upon this very dais, in that very robe, and gave judgment over my father's death before this hold. Today I will give it. The hall went very, very quiet. And I told them plainly, and I told them all, high and low together, and I did not spare a word of it. How the still-room girl had come running up from the low chamber with the truth of it screaming out of her, and her Alpha's blood to her elbows from trying with her own hands to hold his life inside him. How the Reeve had taken her grief and turned it inside out into her crime. How he had built his murder trial out of 4 witnesses, of whom 1 was now dead and 2 now rich on freeholds, granted the very year they swore, and 1 now fled north with silver. And out of a healer's silence, a healer conveniently taken by a fever the winter after he might have described the wound. How the girl had never once confessed, in all those careful pages, because there was no confession to be had from an innocent woman. And how the Reeve had stopped her mouth for 10 years not with grief and not with the mark alone, but with a hostage, her own young brother, a boy of 9, taken north into the Reeve's own hand at Greywater the very morning after the judgment, and held there as a living leash, so that the girl understood, without 1 word ever needing to be spoken, exactly what her first true sentence would cost the child she loved. The murmur rose and swelled and broke against the walls, and the Reeve opened his mouth to pour his smooth denial down over all of it the way he had poured smooth denials over Heir for 10 years. And I opened my fist. "My father's seal," I said, and I held it up high above my head, turning it so the wolf of our house and the dark unscrubbed stain in its lines could be seen from every corner of the hall. "Cried lost the night he died. Kept hidden 10 years up a cold chimney by the girl you all named his killer. Kept safe against the day his son should come home and ask." And then into the rising roar, I held up the scrap of torn gray wool with the silver heron pinned through it, and I held it high, and I let them all look at it, and I let their eyes travel from the heron in my hand to the heron on the Reeve's own shoulder, and I watched the whole packed hall of them understand at once, all together, the way the ground understands the falling stone. "Torn from his cloak," I said, "by the woman who found him dying as she flung herself at the man who had just knifed her Alpha in the dark. She kept it 10 years, up the chimney, for his son." And I turned then to Aloan, where she stood at the very foot of the dais in her gray scullion's dress with the old burned mark plain on her throat, thin and grave and utterly unbowed among all those staring faces, and I said gently, so gently before the whole silent hold, "Speak now if you can and if you wish to. No soul in this hall will ever silence you again. I stand between you and the whole of the world. Tell them in your own voice what you saw." The Reeve moved then. I saw it, the killer's last blind reflex, his hand going out toward the girl even now, even here, ringed by the whole hold, 10 years of habit reaching to shut the one mouth that could end him. And my wolf came up out of me at last, all the way, not in body but in voice and eye and the roll of the air, and I loosed it across that hall, and the Reeve's outstretched hand froze in the air as if the cold had taken it. And every guardsman in the hall who was his own man took a full step back and away from him, because a hold guard is bred in the bone to fear an Alpha, and there was an Alpha standing in Heir Hall that morning, awake and terrible, and it was no longer the man in gray. And into that vast frozen silence, Aloan lifted her head and found her voice, and though it cracked and though it shook, it climbed, and it carried to every corner and every soul, and it did not stop. "I loved him," she said, "your father, Alpha Garrick. He took me in off the road when I was orphaned and starving, me and my little brother both, and he gave us a home and a place and his own kindness, and I would have died for him 100 times before I let harm come near him." Her gray eyes went to the Reeve, and the last of the fear was burned clean out of them now, and what was left was 10 years of held-back fire. "I heard a sound in the low chamber that night. I ran to it. And I saw you, standing over him with the knife red in your hand and his blood spreading on the stone. And I threw myself at you, and I tore your cloak, and I wrenched his ring out of your fist where you'd already taken it, and you struck me off and you fled up the dark stair, and I held him while he died, and his last word in all the world was mercy, and you took that mercy off a dying man's lips and forged my chains out of it." Her voice rose, clear and ringing and terrible now, a voice 10 years buried, come all the way back. "You took my brother. You carried a boy of 9 off into your own hills, and you told me with your eyes, only your eyes, what would befall him if ever I spoke. So I did not speak. 10 years I did not speak. I let them burn me and shun me and spit your own crime at my back as my name to keep one child alive." She was weeping openly now, and still she did not stop, would not stop, 10 years pouring out of her at last. "His name is Perrin. He is a grown man now, a good man, and no thanks to you that he lived to be one. And this morning, Reeve, I woke and felt the leash go slack around my throat, because the Alpha's own men rode through the night to Greywater and pulled my brother out of your hand, and he is free of you now, and so, at last, so am I." And at the great door of the hall, in that very moment, my 2 border wolves came shouldering through the crowd, travel filthy, gray with dust, hard-ridden through a night and a day and a night again without sleep. And between them walked a young man of 19, thin and wary, and blinking in the torchlight of the hall he could not remember, with Aloin's own gray eyes set in a rougher, sun-browned face. And when Aloin saw her brother whole and standing and free and home, 10 years of iron went out of her all at once, all together, and her knees gave way beneath her. I came down off the dais in 3 strides and caught her before she reached the stone, and I lifted her up against me and held her on her feet before the whole hold of Heir. And across the hall Perrin broke from between my men and came running, and the Reeve stood exposed and alone in the wreckage of his 10 smooth years, with the truth risen all around him now like a cold tide he could no longer smooth flat. There was no denial left in him then. There was nothing left to deny it to. The hold that had bowed to him and feared him and taken his word as law for 10 long years looked at him now and saw, all at once and all together, exactly what he was, and the looking was itself the judgment, harder than any word I could have spoken. I gave him to Bran and Corran. I will not set down here the particulars of what a wolf hold does, by its own old and iron law, to a man who murders its alpha in the dark, and then enslaves an innocent woman for 10 years to bury the deed. It is hard law and it is ancient law, and it was done, in the daylight, before witnesses, by the law and not by my hand in the night. That mattered to me more than I can easily say. I had promised my father, at his cold stone, a true thing done in the light, and not one more smooth story done in the dark. And so it was done in the light. But I will tell you the other thing. The thing that is the reason this tale is still told in Heir on the winter nights, to the young ones who never knew any of it, who know only the Luna in the still room with the good and gentle hands. When the Reeve was taken and dragged out, and the hall was one great uproar of 10 years breaking loose, and Aloin stood shaking in the circle of my arm with her weeping brother's arms around them both, the hold's wolves came. They came in through the great door, past the roaring crowd, our own gray wolves, the pack that runs wild and free in the riverwoods below the walls, that no man calls to heel and no man commands, that had not set a single paw inside that hall since the black night my father died in it. They came in a silent gray tide with their great heads held low, and the crowd fell back before them in a hush, pressing to the walls, and the wolves crossed the whole long length of the hall, and they did not come to me, their alpha, their king by blood and right. They went to her. They flowed around Aloin where she stood and wringed her clothes, and then, one by one, the great gray wolves of Heir lowered themselves to the cold stone before the woman the hold had called a murderess for 10 years, and lay down at her feet, and put their heads upon their paws, and were still, the whole wild pack bowing. And last of all, because I am a wolf, and the moon made me one, and there are turning points in a life when the moon lets its work be seen, the shape of my own wolf rose shining in the air at her side, the great silver spirit wolf of our royal line that shows itself only at the hinges of a life, luminous and vast, filling the hall with pale light. And it too bent its enormous head and knelt before her, my mate, before them all. The pack that had shunned her went down on their knees. Every soul of them. The lords who had turned their faces from her at the feast, the servants who had spat toward her mark in the passages, the very guardsmen who had come for her with rope in the dark not 6 hours gone, one by one, and then in a great falling wave all down the length of that hall, they went down on their knees, in shame and in wonder and in 10 years of wrong come suddenly, unbearably, into the clear light at last. They knelt to the silent maid. And she stood in the very middle of it in her scullion's gray, with the wild wolves lying at her feet, and the light of my spirit wolf pale on her worn face and her brother's hand gripping hers. And she was not silent any longer, and she was not a maid, and she had never for one single hour of those 10 years been the thing they had all named her. Not a murderess, I said quietly into that vast kneeling hush, and I said it so that every soul in Heir would carry it out of that hall in their 2 ears and never, ever lose it again. Your Luna. She was always your Luna. She only waited 10 years in the dark for the rest of us to grow worthy of her. I could give you the coronation, if you wished it. The cloak of state I laid across her thin shoulders before the assembled hold, the feast that ran 3 days, the slow seasons in which the burned mark upon her throat faded and faded, until at last you had to know exactly where it had been to find its trace at all. I could tell you how her brother Perrin has the running of my stables now, and rides at my right hand where a false gray reeve once sat and smiled. I could tell you how the whole of Heir, to the last soul, spent years in the quiet work of trying to make right what it had done to her, small kindnesses, a place made at every fire, her name spoken now like a blessing where it had once been spat like a curse, and how she let them, gently, one and all, because she was and is a gentler soul than any of us had the right to be given. But those are not the parts I keep closest. The part I keep is small, and it is mine, and it is this. A year to the day after the great horn woke Heir, I woke in the deep of the night and Aloan was not beside me, and I rose and went down through the sleeping hold to find her, the way I had gone down that first cold night home, and I found her in the still room, not scrubbing, not hiding, not braced in a corner waiting for the blow. She was sitting easy on the low bench in the pooled rushlight, with my father's cleaned and mended ring hung on a fine cord at her throat where the mark had been, grinding herbs in the old stone bowl with her sleeves pushed up, because she loved the work, and had asked to keep it, and I would sooner have pulled down the walls than deny her one thing she asked, a Luna of Heir in the still room by her own free choosing. And when I came in she looked up, and she was not afraid, and she did not rise, and she did not drop her eyes. She smiled at me, and she said my name. Only that, Alaric. In the voice she had buried alive to save a child, and I had helped her dig back up out of the dark. The voice that was hers again now, and would be hers till the last of our days, saying my name in the small warm dark of the one room in all the wide world that had never once turned its face away from her. I sat down on the low stool where I had sat that first night to make myself small again, to put my head below hers, and she reached across the little space between us and laid her fingers light as a falling leaf on the back of my hand, the way she had the night she first dared, by her own free will, to touch another living soul, and the green rain scent rose warm around us both, and I have never once, in all the long good years since, felt that old stone come back down upon my chest. You held your silence 10 years for the love of a boy, I said to her low in the rushlight. What would you do for me, I wonder? And Aloan, who had broken a decade of silence at last to hand me the truth and set us both free, tilted her head, and thought about it seriously, the way she thought about everything. And then, in her own regained voice, grave and gray-eyed and wholly, finally her own, she gave me the answer I have carried like a warm coal in my chest through every winter since. Speak, she said. For you, my Alpha, I would never stop speaking again.